Asher had devoted a year of his life to a lie. He had willingly entered what he thought was a romance simulation, spiriting away the comatose man from a private care facility. His mission was simple: build intimacy points through nightly rituals until he could return to his own world. The work had been physically demanding, carving his lean frame into something solid, with abs he'd never thought possible. The digital entity that served as his guide had promised this was the path home. But on the eve of the man's awakening, the truth crashed down on him. He'd been tending to the wrong person. He'd been sleeping with a monster. He wasn't in a romance story. He was in a horror game. And the man in the bed was Julian Croft, the game's dormant, psychopathic final boss. A notoriously straight, homophobic entity who dismembered anyone who dared to desire him. As Asher reached for the sleeping man's pajama bottoms, the long silent interface in his mind crackled to life, delivering the catastrophic news. His gaze fell upon the face on the pillow, a canvas of angelic, sculpted features that belied the horror beneath. This was Julian, the predator who ensured no player ever reached the game's end CRS. The entity explained Julian's coma wasn't an illness but a recuperative state, a pause before his return to full power, and he was scheduled to wake up tomorrow. Asher buried his face in his hands, a wave of pure despair washing over him. He asked the system in a panicked whisper if this was how he was going to die. The system, with a tone that bordered on apologetic, admitted its own culpability. It had misread the entry data. As a concession, it had petitioned for a special dispensation. If Asher could survive in this world for 1 year, just one, he would be granted passage back to reality. It was a miserable offer, but it was the only one he had. He had to take it. The system added, with a digitized word that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle, that Asher was the most audacious user it had ever monitored. To make the game's ultimate terror his personal project was a new level of nerve. Asher managed a dry laugh, thanking it for the compliment. Then came the unexpected query, a hint of electronic curiosity in its tone, about whether he was a top or a bottom. Before meeting Julian, Asher had never been with anyone, but he'd always pictured himself as the one in control. Seeing Julian's stunning face had only solidified that conviction. But then he had undressed him, and the sheer physical perfection of the man had made him reconsider his entire identity. It would be a crime to waste such a flawless canvas. Still, pride was a powerful thing. He straightened his spine and lied through his teeth, asserting his top status with a bravado he didn't feel. The system issued a sound of admiration, calling him the man of all men, a true fighter for making the terror boss his conquest. Ignoring the guilt churning in his stomach, Asher accepted the praise. He hastily dressed while the system prattled on, his mind already fixed on escape. He threw essentials into a backpack, not daring to waste a second packing everything he'd accumulated over the year. The apartment that had been his sanctuary was now the monster's den. By the next day, he was dragging his suitcase across the manicured lawns of Northwood University. The system had fabricated a new identity for him. Asher Cole, a freshman in the business administration program, the same major he'd been pursuing back home. It offered a small comfort, informing him that it had applied a special filter, a kind of olfactory camouflage. Julian, it turned out, could have tracked him by scent. Asher was horrified, asking if that meant the man could smell him before. After a long, guilty pause, the system confessed it had only just discovered this feature and that Julian was already closing in, having reached the campus gates. It assured him the patch was now active, masking the distinct caramel vanilla scent that had clung to Asher for a year. It advised him to use strong cologne as an added precaution. Asher asked if he could just skip college altogether. The system replied that it was impossible. It had spent its remaining currency on his tuition and meal plan. The alternative was living on the streets. Resigned, Asher bought a cheap can of body spray from a campus store and doused himself in it. Later that day, he was in his new dorm room, absorbed in a video game, when the door swung open. His final roommate had arrived. The man had to duck his head slightly to clear the doorframe. He had to be at least 6'3". As a gay man, Asher's eyes were immediately drawn to his legs. Long, straight, and powerful. A black button-down shirt was tucked into dark jeans, stretching taut across a lean, muscular torso. One hand was casually hooked in his pocket. The other hung at his side, its long, elegant fingers pale and perfectly formed. Asher found himself thinking that if the face matched the body, this man was some kind of god-tier gay fantasy. He lifted his gaze. The world tilted on its axis. His blood ran cold, and his legs gave out from under him, sending him to his knees with a thud. It was Julian Croft, those beautiful, chilling green eyes fixed on him. A swarm of invisible ants seemed to crawl up his spine, a prickling mixture of terror and ma. Asher scrambled to his feet, trying to salvage some dignity. He stammered that his leg had cramped up, causing him to stumble. Without waiting for a reaction, he bolted from the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. How could Julian be his roommate? He had to get a new room. 2 hours later, he slunk back into the same dorm, defeated. The housing administrator had flatly denied his request. Under university policy, all freshmen were required to live on campus for the first year. He was trapped. For the next 12 months, he would have to sleep in the same room as the monster from his nightmares. From that day on, Asher treated Julian like a ghost, avoiding him whenever possible and maintaining a polite, sterile distance when they couldn't. Julian, for his part, seemed to regard him with the same cool indifference. Asher clung to the hope that they could coexist peacefully for the year. He told himself that Julian had been in a vegetative state. He couldn't possibly know who had been with him during that time. He wouldn't be recognized. He was sitting in class, the afternoon light filtering through the campus oaks, dappling the room in shifting patterns. His gaze drifted to Julian, who sat by the window. The light caught the golden undertones in his hair and traced the sharp, elegant lines of his profile. His high cheekbones and the strong bridge of his nose gave him a classical, almost severe beauty. At his height, he was a natural standout and had quickly become the object of campus-wide adoration. Asher had seen several girls approach him, their hopes high. Each time, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. They didn't know they were flirting with a predator who could snap a neck as easily as breaking a twig. The system had told him that at night, players were pulled into a separate dimensional plane for the hunts, an arena invisible to the normal NPCs of this world. Asher's current role was to be one of those oblivious NPCs. Lost in thought, he didn't realize he was staring until Julian turned his head. Their eyes met. The cool, remote gaze of those emerald eyes sent a shiver of pure fear down his spine. Asher quickly looked away, his pulse racing. That evening, he sat on a bench in a secluded grove, the scent of magnolia heavy in the humid air. He wanted to rewatch his favorite film, something he hadn't dared to do with Julian in the dorm. It was that film that had led to his exile a year before he entered the simulation. His father, discovering his orientation, had reacted with horror, convinced his son was mentally ill. He'd had Asher committed to an institution for a year, a place of sterile walls and forced cures. They tried to reprogram him, forcing him to watch heteronormative films and confess an attraction to women he didn't feel. The memory of the electroshock therapy, the searing pain, was a phantom that still haunted him. The only thing that had kept him sane was replaying his favorite movies in his head. His mother had eventually found him and gotten him out, but the damage was done. He was left with a deep-seated fear of real intimacy, his hands shaking uncontrollably whenever he tried to get close to another man. The system's offer had been a lifeline, a chance to explore his desires in a world of pixels and code, where his father's judgment couldn't reach him. He was engrossed in the film when a low voice cut through the night. A male voice asked him if he was gay. He looked up. It was Julian. Asher's blood turned to ice. He remembered the systems. Julian hated gay men, particularly tops, after a bad experience before he was chosen as a boss. He feared this was it, the moment Julian would remember the person who had kept him hidden for a year. But Julian's expression was merely one of cold disdain. He pointed out that Asher was drooling. Asher instinctively wiped his mouth, his face flushing with heat. Julian's green eyes flicked from Asher's face to his phone, where his screen name, TigerTop1, was clearly visible. A flicker of something crossed his features before he turned and walked away without another word. Asher could finally breathe again, but the undisguised revulsion in Julian's eyes left a bitter taste in his mouth. He quickly shook it off. It didn't matter. 1 year and he'd be gone. He waited a long time before returning to the dorm. When he did, he avoided looking at Julian. As lights out approached, they both moved to climb into their beds at the same time, nearly colliding. Julian flinched back, a cold look on his face, and gestured for Asher to go first. The message was clear. Now that he knew Asher was gay, he wanted even more distance. In his eyes, Asher was something unclean. An hour later, Julian had swapped beds with their other roommate, moving to the bunk diagonally across from Asher. Asher felt a pang of hurt, but relief quickly followed. This was for the best. No more close contact until his time was up. The next day, the housing administrator informed him that a spot had opened up in another dorm. He could move in 2 days. Asher suspected Julian was behind it but didn't question his good fortune. A few nights later, the class president organized a karaoke night at a downtown bar. Pushing open the door to the private room, Asher's eyes landed on Julian, who was seated in a shadowy corner of the large U-shaped booth. The pulsing colored lights painted one side of his face in strobing hues, leaving the other in darkness. He looked like a predator lying in wait. Julian didn't even glance his way, treating him like he was invisible. Asher chose a seat as far away from him as possible. An hour of bad singing and cheap beer later, the group started a game of truth or dare. Julian was chosen. The question was whether he had ever been in love. Asher mentally shook his head. The system had been clear. The boss was a cold-blooded killer, incapable of love. But then Julian's quiet affirmation stunned the room. He said yes. A murmur went through the group. People pressed for details. Who was she? Was she a student here? Julian's expression softened, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time Asher had ever seen. He described her as a very sweet girl. Asher's curiosity piqued. Had Julian fallen for someone on campus? Or was this someone from his past the system didn't know about? Julian, however, became tight-lipped, refusing to say more. A few rounds later, it was Asher's turn. He drew a dare. He had to be blindfolded and kiss a random person in the room. He groaned internally. Kissing a girl felt dishonest. He decided he would aim for the cheek, a quick, harmless peck. Once the blindfold was on, the world went dark. He stumbled forward, guided by the sounds and smells around him. He caught the clean, citrusy scent of bergamot, a fragrance he didn't associate with Julian. Relieved, he decided that was his target. He lunged forward, wrapping his arms around the person like a koala. The person's breathing hitched. Asher mumbled an apology, then reached up to find their face. He rose on his toes to plant a kiss on their cheek, but at that exact moment, the person turned their head. Their lips met. It was a soft, wet, shocking connection. And the man was tall, impossibly tall. Besides the 6'3" Julian, the only other tall guy was the class president, who was maybe 6'1". It had to be the president. A sense of petty revenge filled him. The room erupted in whoops and whistles. Grinning, Asher pulled off the blindfold. The smile died on his face. Bathed in the glow of the karaoke machine, looking utterly ethereal, was Julian. His green eyes were wide with a flicker of disbelief. And smeared on his perfect, crimson lips was a smudge of Asher's cherry-flavored lip balm, making them look even more vivid. Asher's legs went weak again, and for the second time, he found himself kneeling before Julian Croft. A strange, fleeting look of astonishment crossed Julian's face before it was replaced by a slow, mocking smile. His pale fingers came up to wipe at his lips, smearing the bomb. He remarked that Asher seemed to have a fondness for kneeling before him. Mortified, Asher scrambled to his feet, muttering that his legs were just unreliable. Amidst the jeers of his classmates, he fled the bar. Outside, under the pale moon, Asher touched his own neck. It was over. He was a dead man. He would never get back to his own world. If he was gonna die, he might as well go out with a bang. He ended up at a gay club watching the dancers on the stage. Their movements were fluid and powerful, but as they peeled off their shirts to reveal sculpted torsos, Asher couldn't help but compare them to Julian. None of them had his grace, his perfect proportions. A man in a dark shirt approached him, his intentions clear, but Asher found he wasn't interested. His year with Julian had spoiled him. Besides, the man was clearly a bottom, and after his lie to the system, Asher felt a strange new commitment to that role. He was content to just watch. When he got back to the dorm, Julian was awake, sitting at his desk under a small lamp, a book open in front of him. He looked up as Asher entered, his eyes dark and unreadable. Asher's scalp prickled. This was it. The execution. He resigned himself to his fate, hoping Julian would just strangle him in his sleep. After a quick shower, he climbed into bed, having taken a sleeping pill in anticipation of a painful death. He didn't know that long after he fell asleep, a slender hand pushed aside the privacy curtain around his bunk. Julian stood over him, his face a mask of cold fury. He had finally found him. He hadn't seen his face, but the taste of his kiss was identical. He whispered that he couldn't believe the one who had kept him for a year, who had touched him so intimately, was a boy. Rage flared in his eyes. His hand reached for Asher's throat. But at that moment, Asher, dreaming of eating a lollipop, turned his head and latched onto Julian's extended finger, his mouth closing around it. He mumbled something about grape candy. The cold fury in Julian's eyes vanished, replaced by sheer, dumbfounded shock. A deep red flush crept up his neck and bloomed across his ears. He stood frozen for a long moment before carefully extracting his finger. He watched Asher's sleeping face, a new conflict warring within him. He whispered to himself that he would observe a little longer, figure out what this was all about. The next morning, Asher woke up with a lingering taste of grapes in his mouth, which was odd since his toothpaste was peach-flavored. He shrugged it off and checked his neck. Still attached. He had survived another night. He did notice, however, that Julian was watching him with an intensity that was new and unsettling. The look in his eyes was complex, a mixture of struggle and something else he couldn't decipher. Later, the housing administrator called to tell him the other dorm spot was no longer available. His move was canceled. A few days later, under the blazing sun of the basketball court, Asher was drenched in sweat. He instinctively pulled up his jersey to wipe his face, exposing the hard-earned abs beneath. A chorus of appreciative whistles came from the girls on the sidelines, making him blush, but he also felt a single, searing gaze fixed on him. He scanned the crowd and his eyes met Julian's. He was sitting in the bleachers, his expression unreadable. Frightened, Asher dropped his shirt and focused on the game. Back in the dorm, after a shower, he realized he'd forgotten to grab a shirt, bringing only a pair of shorts. He decided to just make a dash for it. As he stepped out of the bathroom, the dorm room door opened and Julian walked in. Julian's gaze fell on him, and it felt like a physical touch, a cold, slithering thing that traveled from his bare legs up to his chest. Goosebumps erupted on his skin. Asher quickly grabbed a shirt and threw it on. The strange, possessive stare didn't leave him until he was safely hidden in his bunk. That night, the horror games boss was several hours late to his own hunt. He spent the first hour sitting by Asher's bed, simply watching him sleep. Julian's throat was dry. He murmured to the sleeping boy, calling him a devious little gay, certain this was all a calculated seduction. He vowed not to fall for it. The next day in class, Asher pulled a rocket pop from his pocket and bit into the frozen treat. his lips turning red from the cold. He scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the fact that 3 rows behind him, Julian was watching his every move. Julian's grip on his pen tightened, his knuckles white. He was unconsciously scribbling on his notebook, his focus entirely on Asher's mouth. The bell rang, startling him. He looked down at the page. The words "wanna kiss" were written over and over, a frantic, desperate scrawl. The pen in his hand snapped in two. This was impossible. Asher was a boy. The thought did nothing to quell the storm raging inside him. After his shower that evening, Asher had to pass Julian's desk. He hugged the opposite wall, trying to create as much space as possible between them. Julian didn't look up from his book. Just as Asher thought he'd made it, Julian's voice, low and cool, stopped him. He asked what kind of cologne he was using. Asher's nerves tightened. He thought maybe he'd sprayed too much and was annoying the boss. He meekly replied that it was just some cheap brand called Six God. Julian said nothing more, and Asher retreated to his desk. He didn't see Julian subtly inhale, his eyes closing for a moment. The scent he used to find cloying now seemed intoxicating. The seduction, he thought with a grim sense of defeat, was working. One afternoon on his way back from the dining hall, a voice called his name. He turned to see a vaguely familiar face. The guy, wearing a white shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, grinned at him. He reminded Asher that they'd met at the gay club. He introduced himself as Liam, a sophomore in the business school, and asked for his number. Asher knew what he wanted, but he wasn't interested. Plus, they were both bottoms. As if reading his mind, Liam blurted out that he could be versatile. Asher was taken aback by the offer. Standing under a large banyan tree 100 feet away, Julian watched them, his face a mask of glacial fury. If Asher had turned around, he would have seen him standing there like a vengeful specter. Just as Asher was about to politely decline Liam's offer, a flock of crows descended from the sky, swarming Liam, cawing and pecking at him. Liam yelled, swatting at them as he ran. Asher, shocked, tried to help, using his jacket to wave the birds away, but more kept coming. The attack only ceased when Liam managed to flee the campus and jump into a taxi. The crows dispersed as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only a few scattered black feathers. Asher stood there for a moment, bewildered, before heading back to his dorm. He didn't see the single crow that broke from the flock and landed silently on Julian's shoulder. The next day, Asher received an anonymous text containing a link to a medical report. It was Liam's. He had a host of STDs. When Liam approached him again, Asher shut him down harshly. Back in the dorm, Julian was radiating an icy anger. Asher wondered who had been foolish enough to provoke the boss. He showered and, as always, gave Julian a wide berth. The moment the bathroom door clicked shut, Julian's eyes, full of a maddening jealousy, darted to his reflection in the mirror. He studied his own face, his own body. Was that other man better looking than him? Half an hour later, Asher emerged from the bathroom, toweling his wet hair. He stopped dead, the towel falling from his hand. Julian was standing in the middle of the room, shirtless. His torso was a masterpiece of lean muscle, the 8-pack of his abdominals sharply defined. A jolt went through Asher. He remembered the feeling of those muscles under his hands, night after night. His palms began to itch with the phantom sensation. He balled his hands into fists, digging his nails into his skin. He couldn't think about that. He forced himself to look away and hurried to his desk, pulling up a horror movie on his tablet to distract himself. Julian watched him, a frown creasing his brow. A flicker of hurt and self-doubt crossed his features. Why wasn't Asher looking at him? He used to feel those hands on his abs 100 times a day. The next morning, Asher woke to the sight of Julian doing push-ups on the floor, still shirtless. The morning sun slanted through the window, highlighting the beautiful musculature of his back. Asher watched through a crack in his bed curtains, his heart pounding. He was so handsome, He wanted so badly to touch him. He pinched his own cheek hard and quickly closed the curtain, burying his face in his pillow. On the floor, Julian paused, a faint, triumphant smile on his lips. His eyesight was exceptional. He had seen the undisguised desire in Asher's eyes. In class that morning, Asher was dozing at his desk when he felt someone sit down next to him. He opened his eyes. It was Julian. There were dozens of empty seats in the lecture hall. Why was he sitting here, unwilling to puzzle out the boss's logic? Asher simply got up and moved 2 rows back. Julian's green eyes narrowed, a storm brewing in their depths. At lunch, Julian sat directly across from him in the crowded cafeteria. And when he returned to the dorm that night, he discovered Julian had switched their beds back. He was once again sleeping in the bunk next to his. A wild thought sparked in Asher's mind. Could Julian have feelings for him? The idea was so hot it felt like it might burn through his skull. His heart hammered for a few seconds before he violently shook his head, extinguishing the notion.
Impossible.
Julian was straight. He had a sweet girl he was in love with. Asher was just overthinking things. That night, Julian was drinking. Several empty beer cans littered his desk. He looked sullen and flushed, his eyes glazed over. Asher decided it was best not to interfere. He showered and went to bed, falling asleep quickly. He was woken later by a heavy, warm weight pressing down on him. He opened his eyes and found Julian's face inches from his own. The sleep vanished, replaced by sheer panic. Julian, shirtless and wearing only a pair of gray sweatpants, had climbed into his bed. He was clearly drunk, reeking of alcohol. He was draped over Asher, his eyes hazy, his hot breath ghosting across Asher's neck. Asher's heart went into overdrive. He glanced at the other 2 bunks. Empty. Their roommates must be out for the night. He tried to push Julian off, telling him he was drunk and in the wrong bed. But the intoxicated man was like a lead weight, and his lips only moved closer. The proximity was overwhelming. Julian's face was just too beautiful, too potent. Asher remembered the moment he first saw him, the cardiac arrest of instant infatuation. The year he'd spent with him had been the happiest, most thrilling of his life. All those feelings he'd suppressed since learning the truth now came rushing back, a volcanic eruption of desire. He had to dig his nails into his palm again, the pain a necessary anchor to reality. He couldn't touch him. If Julian remembered this when he sobered up, he would be furious. Just as Julian's lips were a centimeter from his, Asher clapped a hand over his mouth. His face burned as he said Julian needed to sober up and that he would get him some water. He tried to squirm out from under him, but Julian's arms tightened around him. He leaned in, his lips brushing Asher's ear, and murmured a husky, sensual don't. A jolt of electricity shot through Asher. The drunken boss was so clingy. He must be mistaking him for the girl he liked. A bitter pang went through his heart, and with a sudden surge of strength, he pushed Julian off, saying he needed to use the bathroom. He fled to the washroom. When he returned, he brought a glass of honey water, which Julian refused to take. Instead, he just looked at Asher with wide, watery eyes, the red at the corners making him look heartbreakingly vulnerable. Defeated, Asher held the glass to his lips and helped him drink. He then tried to coax him back to his own bed, but Julian refused to move. Instead, he started fumbling with Asher's pants. Asher, having anticipated something like this, had put on a pair of jeans and fastened a small luggage lock through the zipper pull and a belt loop. Julian's fingers found the cold metal of the lock, and his drunken expression faltered with confusion. Asher awkwardly removed his hand, telling him not to be impulsive. Finally giving up, Asher decided to let Julian have his bed and went to sleep in Julian's. But Julian's arms snaked around his waist, pulling him back, refusing to let him go. Trapped, Asher found himself lying next to him, the warmth of his body a familiar comfort. It felt just like all those nights when Julian was still the silent man in the bed. He decided to allow himself this one indulgence. Soon he drifted off to sleep. Julian, however, was wide awake. His green eyes filled with a frustrated, resentful light. He couldn't believe it. Even when he offered himself up on a silver platter, the boy still said no. Had he lost his charm completely? At 5 the next morning, the system's alarm blared in Asher's mind. He could leave this world ahead of schedule. He had 3 days left. A year ago, he would have wept with joy. Now, a profound hesitation took root. He looked at the handsome face so close to his, a dull ache spreading through his chest. He asked the system if he had to leave. A part of him wanted to stay. The system confirmed that this was his only chance. If he missed this window, he would be trapped here forever. Asher understood. His eyes traced the lines of Julian's face. This would be the last time he would ever see him this close. His gaze settled on his lips. The last time he could ever kiss him. On impulse, he leaned down and gently pressed his lips to Julian's. They tasted sweet like grapes. Julian's eyelashes fluttered against his cheek. A wave of sadness washed over Asher. He slipped out of bed before Julian could wake and went to the shower, letting the hot water mingle with his tears. As he was getting dressed, he heard a strange, digitized scream from the hallway. He quickly pulled on his clothes and followed the sound. The scene that greeted him was surreal. Julian, looking utterly menacing, had his foot planted on a small metallic cube that looked like a futuristic modem. The cube was shrieking for mercy. Julian's voice was like ice. "What system? This is my world. You think you can take what's mine?" The cube wailed that it was just a low-level employee. Asher clapped a hand over his mouth, a thrill running through him. Julian was so cool, he was even stepping on the system. And what's mine? Could he mean him? Julian's voice was low and possessive. He declared that Asher was staying. He must have overheard his conversation with the system. The metallic cube pleaded with Julian, explaining that it had to take Asher back because his physical body was deteriorating in this world. If he stayed any longer, he would die. A flicker of panic crossed Julian's face. Just then, the crow on Julian's shoulder took flight and swooped towards Asher, forcing him to cry out. Both Julian and the system turned. The system yelled for its host to save it from his crazy boyfriend. Asher met Julian's intense green gaze and offered a weak smile. He told the system that he was hardly in a position to save anyone. Julian strode towards him, his presence so powerful it felt like it was sucking all the air out of the hallway. He stopped right in front of Asher, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. He asked if Asher had heard everything. Asher, seeing the look in his eyes, could only nod. Julian's smile widened. He said that was good. It saved him the trouble of explaining that he was in love with him. Asher's mind went blank. In love with him? He stammered, asking wasn't he straight? Julian stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, that he wasn't anymore, not after falling for him. Asher felt dizzy. He then asked about the sweet girl he'd mentioned. Julian chuckled. He said he had been looking for Asher the whole time. He had just assumed his mysterious caretaker was a girl. That kiss during the dare, he explained, was when he knew for sure. Asher was incredulous. He asked how he could recognize him from a single kiss. Julian's fingers traced Asher's lips. He said simply that some things, once tasted, are impossible to forget, because it was too sweet. Then he asked if Asher loved him too. Before Asher could answer, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, thrilling growl. He said if Asher loved him, it would be a happy bonus. But if he didn't, he was very curious to see what taking something by force would feel like. A predatory excitement gleamed in his eyes. Asher's heart trembled. He had no doubt Julian meant it. "I love you," Asher said immediately, without a shred of hesitation. A blazing, possessive heat filled Julian's eyes. "No takebacks," he murmured, and then his mouth was on his, fierce and hungry. It was the first time Asher had ever been kissed with such raw passion, and it left him breathless. On the floor, the system remained silent, forced to watch. When they finally broke apart, Asher was panting in Julian's arms. The system weakly reminded them that Asher really only had 3 days left. The flame of joy in Asher's heart flickered. Julian's hand moved to the back of his neck, his breath warm against his ear. So what? Even if it's only 3 days, we'll still have them. Right, baby? A hint of danger laced his tone, but Asher was too lost in the sadness of their impending separation to notice. His first real relationship would only last 72 hours. They spent those 3 days in a hotel room. As Asher's consciousness faded, his last thought was that for a year, he had been the one in control. Now, he finally understood just how ferocious Julian could be. Back in the real world, his therapist was amazed by his progress. The psychological aversion to physical contact with men, the phantom pains and uncontrollable shaking, were gone. Asher just smiled. He knew it was Julian who had healed him. He also realized, with a fond, retrospective clarity, that Julian's drunken night, his shirtless displays, it had all been a deliberate, clumsy attempt at seduction. He'd been so blind. The thought made him laugh, but the laughter was always followed by a hollow ache. He'd left his heart in another world. A week later, still in a daze, he started his freshman year of college, a year behind schedule. He dragged his suitcase to his assigned dorm room and pushed open the door. He was hit by a familiar, clean scent of bergamot. A tall, broad-shouldered man with his back to him was making a bed. His heart began to pound. He knew that silhouette. The man turned, a wide, brilliant smile spreading across his face. "Baby, you're here. I already made your bed." Asher's hands started to shake. Couldn't be real. "Julian? How are you here?" Julian crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled him into a crushing hug, as if trying to merge their bodies into one. He explained that he'd made a deal with the system. He had found a successor to be the new boss of his world, and in exchange, the system had brought him here. In this world, he was just as ordinary as Asher. Joy, pure and overwhelming, flooded through Asher. He clung to Julian, tears welling in his eyes. He thought he would never see him again. Julian tilted his chin up, his green eyes a swirling mix of tenderness and obsession. He looked at Asher as if he were the only thing in the universe. "I would never let you go," he whispered. "You're mine. I'd find you at the ends of the earth." He leaned in, his warm breath caressing Asher's face. "I love you. I missed you so much." Asher's heart felt like it would explode. This time, he was the one who surged forward, his fingers gripping the fabric of Julian's shirt as he crashed their lips together. When the kiss ended, he smiled, finally able to say the words that had been sitting in his heart for days. "I missed you too. So much. I love you."